All right, folks, here we go again. We're talking about The Six Secrets of Change, written by Michael Fullan. It says what the best leaders do to help their organizations survive and thrive. Michael Fullan is a professor in Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in University of Toronto. He's recognized as a worldwide authority on organizational change, and he's engaged in training, consulting, and evaluating change projects around the world. So he's written, I believe, 2 books that I know of, and we're going to get into this one. So it's a pretty short book. It's about 140 pages, 135 pages looks like, and pretty densely packed with some good wisdom. I felt like it was a little hard to figure out where we were headed in the first handful of pages of the book, but once he got into his actual 6 secrets, I got a better grasp of what all that intro stuff was. Most of the book is like referring to multiple other studies or books and then breaking down where things were right or wrong with various companies or pieces of literature. 6 secrets. So I'm just going to give you a blurb from the introduction here first. He says, probably the 2 greatest failures of leaders are indecisiveness in times of urgent need for action and dead certainty that they are right in times of complexity. There's really no way for us to guarantee success or know that we're exactly right in a world of such complexity. If you remember back to my interview with Madeline Wise, where she's talking about how we take in literally billions of bits of information on a daily basis, but our brain can only comprehend a very small fraction of that. I can't remember what she says, but it's like in the millions, right? So we're taking in hundreds of billions, and we can only really consciously think about a small fraction of that. So essentially, we're filling in the gaps. We're telling ourselves a story about reality based on a tiny little fraction of reality. And when leaders think they know the answer or can guarantee success, it's a setup for failure. And that immediately reminded me of Ray Dalio, the founder and CEO of Bridgewater. Right, early on in his career, he had found some pretty quick success. I think he was in his 20s. He was quite young and had several $1,000,000 in management and things. And the economy was in a weird place. And he was dead certain he knew what was going to happen with the stock market. And he was dead wrong. And they lost so much money in that time frame following that obviously inaccurate prediction that he eventually had to slowly lay off all of his employees. Even his business partner decided he was done and went in a different direction, and Ray had to start over based on that. And when he started over, he always asked himself, what is the most likely thing? What do I think is right? And then how do I know I'm right? So he made it a purpose of his to get people around him that would challenge his thinking so that he wasn't just in an echo chamber. So I thought that was a really fantastic solution to that problem. So we're going to jump into the 6 secrets now. Secret 1 is love your employees. Secret 1 takes us all the way back to the general theory of Douglas McGregor a half century ago. McGregor contrasted 2 theories of human motivation concerning behavior in the workplace, which is called Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X assumptions. The average human being has an inherent dislike of work and will avoid it if he or she can. Number 2, because of their dislike for work, most people must be controlled and threatened before they will work hard enough. And number 3, the average human prefers to be directed, dislikes responsibility, is unambiguous, and desires security above everything else. So now theory Y assumptions. If a job is satisfying, then the results will be committed to the organization. Number 2, the average person learns under proper conditions not only to accept, but to seek responsibility. Number 3, imagination, creativity, and ingenuity can be used to solve work problems by a large number of employees. So these 2 theories sort of get tested, right? And he starts to break down how people actually are and what it means to either love your employee or love your customer. And those are two different types of management systems or business models, right? And you always hear like the customer is always right, and you can implement that to a degree, but at the same time, you've got to have this a similar approach to your own employees, like what matters to them and how can I show concern for them. So he uses the example of the education system to illustrate this. He says the major trumpet call for education in the United States is a piece of legislation called No Child Left Behind. England's is Every Child Matters. New York City's is Children First. These are the first two sentences of these reports, right? He says, I've centered my own work around the moral imperative of raising the bar and closing the gap of achievement for all children. So I am an advocate for sentiments expressed in these policies, but there is one problem. Secret one tells me that the children first stance are misleading and incomplete. A new report from McKinsey and Company focusing on the top performing school systems in the world provides the central reason why we must value employees. In this case, teachers as much as customers, children, and parents. The quality of education systems cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. He explains on this same topic that leaders, teachers, and principals, and also other businesses, like when they have these really hardcore initiatives to improve the outcomes of the customer, you might get some really fantastic leader to step in, but they express fatigue very rapidly, and most of them are gone within a year or two. At least in the school system, it happens over and over. So you get some underperforming school, you bring in some, social icon type leader in the school world, and they'll change that school, whip it into shape real quick after like a year, but then they're done because it's too cumbersome, burdensome. They get burnout. There's not enough system in place. It relies so heavily on that single person and their charisma that it's not possible to lead. The other problem is all those poor teachers or problems sort of just get kicked out of that school. They just find themselves a new job in a nearby school. So the problem didn't actually change. It just changed for that one school temporarily. So you actually need to find systems, which just ties into one of his later secrets. So the secret number 2, connect peers with purpose. Focus the organization with sharp goals and tight accountability, and you get passive or alienated workers. Go for decentralized creativity, and you get drift and inertia. The key to achieving a simultaneously tight, loose organization lies more in purposeful peer interaction than in top down direction from the hierarchy. So, one thing I'd like to note is he brings up several like dichotomies. Each of his 6 secrets basically require balance uh, in various areas. So a leader who's got confidence, charisma, and sort of stick to itiveness, but doesn't think they have all the answers. Right? He says later in the book that you should take credit for success, but also some blame. Right? You got to have like both. You should focus on the customer and your employee in an equal balance. So he says purposeful peer interaction, or perhaps I should say positive purposeful peer interaction, really testing out the P's on this microphone, works effectively under 3 conditions. Number 1, when the larger values of the organization and those of individuals and groups mesh. Number 2, when information and knowledge about effective practices are widely and openly shared. And number 3, when monitoring mechanisms are in place to detect and address ineffective actions while also identifying and consolidating effective practices. So he goes to the we solution subtitle under this chapter, and he says it's easy to miss the nuances of Secret 2. Peer interaction must be purposeful and must be characterized by high capacity knowledge and skills. Leaders have to provide direction, create the conditions for effective peer interaction, and intervene along the way when things are not working as well as they could. So, first, All stakeholders are rallying around a higher purpose that has meaning for individuals as well as the collectivity. Second, knowledge flows as people pursue and continuously learn what works best. And then third, identifying with an entity larger than oneself expands the self with powerful consequences. Enlarged identity and commitment are the social glue that enable large organizations to cohere. So people want to feel responsible, they want to feel challenged, they want to also feel like they can succeed, and they want to feel like the work they do is for a purpose bigger than just their own little world, right? That they're a part of something larger. It's the tribalism thing. It's our desire to serve other people. It's the desire to represent your country or your town or your city. It's like when you meet somebody that's from your city across the world, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm from there too, right? And you're like immediately sort of friends for some reason, but you don't know them at all, just that they have something in common with you, and that you're out exploring the world and found someone that's from where you are, right? What a strange reason to like somebody, but the point is we feel these connections to tribes and associates, and when we can being at work driving to a goal or mission that's bigger than ourselves and connects us to that mission, it's something that brings us satisfaction and joy. Okay, so moving on to secret number 3, capacity building prevails. Another way to love your employees is to select them well and then invest in their continuous development. So I'm a big fan of this particular secret. I actually like all the secrets, but just like I'm personally drawn to like personal development. I like leading people for the sake of helping them identify their strengths and build on those. And I like leading a team where it's like I see my purpose is to pull out the strengths of everybody in the group and make them available to everyone in the group so that we can all sort of leverage the best that we have. So capacity building, this is an interesting one. He says, one of the ways not to develop capacity is through criticism, punitive consequences, or what I more comprehensively call judgmentalism. Skipping down, he says, intentions don't matter. If people feel stigmatized, they will not be motivated to change. The consequences of insults or even good natured advice aimed at overweight people are multiple and are all negative, including low self esteem, vulnerability to depression, bad eating habits, avoidance of exercise, and general lethargy. Hectoring is not motivating in any walk of life. People do not function well, at least not for very long, when they are scared and angry. So, how do you coach somebody without, like he says, even with good intentions, if it comes off as criticism or negative, they won't respond well. They won't learn, they won't change. So, how do you give, criticism to somebody with the goal of change or improvement when the criticism is often, here's the areas that could be fixed. So you've really got to walk hand in hand. I actually came across this random video on YouTube Shorts last night that illustrated this point in a physical sense. So you jump into the video and he's like got some guy walking with him counting like 8 steps. They're side by side. And then he's like, all right, let's count back 4. He walks back 4, and then he turns around. He's like, fists up, and he just starts pushing on the guy's fists. And the guy pushes back, right? And he goes, when we were walking side by side, he had no resistance. He was willing to walk with me. I didn't tell him to start pushing on me, but as soon as I started pushing on him, he pushed back. Right? It's like this natural reaction. Like we're not just going to move because you push me, right? And if he's explaining the concept to the guys, and he's like, "All right, come here for a minute," and he waves 2 fingers, and the guy walks over, and he's like, "See that? It took 2 fingers and to get him to move to come with me because I asked him to join me. Like come with me has a different response than put your fists up," and then he starts pushing, right? So no verbal cue needed to get the resistance. But then when he says, come here for a second, it's like, oh, sure, I'll come. So you need to really think about how you're giving criticism. And is it a we thing? Is it a system thing? Or are you criticizing the individual? he talks about Toyota a lot through this book because they are one of a few companies who have achieved many of these secrets and made them part of their culture. This section is called Hire and Cultivate Talented People. He says Toyota has a reputation for embodying the idea that good people working with other good people get even better. So Toyota pays the same careful attention to selecting and developing managers and coaches. The attributes it looks for in trainers consist of willingness and ability to learn, adaptability and flexibility, genuine caring and concern for others, patience, persistence, willingness to take responsibility, confidence and leadership, and a questioning nature. The direct skill domain Toyota stresses observation and analytical abilities, communication skills, attention to detail, job knowledge, and respect of fellow peers. They have built in this culture of leadership that really is like positive coaches. People have respect, people who are analytical, and they really want to understand where our strengths are as a collective. How can we build systems around those strengths and then make everybody strong in that area, or make the system so strong that it can't be, it's like fail proof, and do it in a respectful way that's a team approach. And it kind of ties into one of his later secrets here that we'll get to. Secret 4, learning is the work. So he talks about that, like learning on the job, like learning as you do the work is actually far more effective than off the job training. So like when people remove themselves from the actual work environment, go to some other foreign work environment that may or may not totally reflect their environment, and then try and learn some concept and then come back to work, people pretty much just go back to their old habits. Like one of the recent episodes was Atomic Habits, and you don't just change like manufacturing habits because you went to a seminar, right? You change habits by implementing small steps, tweaking things intentionally, making environmental changes, reinforcing with positive outcomes or rewards, suppressing the negative triggers, all those things, right? So you can't really just remove someone from their environment, do training, and then come back and like have like a far better employee. You got to do the work in the environment. The training comes from that environment which they are learning and working. The objective is not to identify whom to blame for a problem, it is to find out where the system failed. Without this philosophy, as we have noted, people have a tendency to hide problems and consequently no one learns. I thought that was a powerful way to say that. You're trying to find problems in the system, not the individuals, right? So if your coaching program stinks, then fix your coaching program so that the results of your employees is better. If your slide decks suck, you're going to have bad presentations. It's not necessarily the presenter, it's the system you've got in place, right? How do you coach for presenting? So if you have good slide decks but the presentations suck, it's your coaching, not the individual. So build for systems. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to it, so I'll bring it up now. As I was talking about Toyota, they focus on building leaders, right? But an interesting fact about Toyota is that when they have turnover of leaders, there's no noticeable effect. And so you would say, like, was that a bad leader, or do they not rely on leaders heavily enough? The thing is that their entire culture is to identify and build leaders. So everyone is essentially capable of stepping into any role and doing a decent job. And so because that's the culture, we develop each other, we're developing the team, we're developing the system. That is their system. Their whole company does that. So there's no noticeable effect. It's not like when you bring in that high performing leader from somewhere else and then they jump into the spotlight. They do a quick turnaround, but they become exhausted and leave, and then you're back to a horrible system with a bad leader, and now you got to go on the hunt again. Toyota is completely opposite from that. All right. Secret 5, transparency rules. He goes in to say what transparency is not. I'll read a little bit of it. He says, so second, I'm skipping a bit, obviously. Transparency is not about gathering reams of data or measuring things that are not amenable to action. Information overload breeds confusion and clutter, not clarity. So everyone knows that measures can focus attention, and many utter that superficial bromide. What gets measured gets done. Not always true. It depends on how you go about it. Further down, he says measures and the measurement process, especially badly designed or unnecessarily complex measurement systems, are among the biggest barriers to turning knowledge into action. Measurements should be guides, helping to direct behavior, but not so powerful that they substitute for the judgment and wisdom that is so necessary to acquire knowledge and turn into action. So I've said this a lot to some of my peers in different workplaces. It's like, I get that, you know, measuring things, it's like that bromide, like what gets measured improves or whatever. I get that that's true when you select the right things to measure and it's concise enough that you can actually focus. But when you measure everything, you actually measure nothing because the data is so complex. There's so much. It feels like you're going in so many directions that it's actually just managing chaos, not focused, intentional attention, right? So when you measure everything, you're measuring nothing. When you measure a few really key indicators, what gets measured can improve, right? So this is now what effective transparency is. I'm going to a piece that he's referencing from Michael Barber. He says Barber tweaks secret 3 more than I recommend, but where we do agree totally is that transparency of performance must be front and center. So really focusing on the transparency of the performance, so your outcomes, right? He's unyieldingly prescriptive when it comes to the gathering and use of transparent data. You have to be prescriptive in demanding that all providers gather data, identify best practices, apply them, and are then held accountable for results. Another example of transparency in the use comes from my colleagues and my work to improve literacy and numeracy across the 4,000 elementary schools in the public education system in Ontario. As part of an overall strategy, we created a new database which was called Statistical Neighbors. All 4,000 schools are in the system. Skipping, he says, simply publishing the results can possibly do some good, but more likely than not would have negative side effects. Instead, we operate under a set of ground rules. Number one, we do not condone starting with what the government in England calls league tables, displaying the results of every school from lowest to highest scores without regard to context. Instead, we do the following: help schools compare themselves with themselves. That is, look at what progress they are making compared to the previous years. B, help schools compare themselves with their statistical neighbors, comparing apples to apples. And C, help schools examine their results relative to an external or absolute standard, such as how other schools in the province are faring and how close they are to achieving 100% success in literacy and numeracy. So basically, you need it to be focused on themselves, on the individual or the system, not just saying like, if Microsoft's always just looking at Apple saying, look what Apple's doing, why aren't we doing this? Well, because Apple makes iPads and iPods and iTunes, and Microsoft is more focused on like software systems that are outsourced to other people's hardware. So it's like you you need to play the game according to the actual real competitors, or the main competitor is yourself, your historical self, right? Looking at how people in your same industry or sport or whatever are doing what you're trying to do, not you know people that are unrelated. So essentially you need to really compare apples to apples, find data that drives like your historical averages compared to today, and what things can we do, what have we found from people that are in a similar situation as us, here's some options, let's teach one another, and then really focus on the improvement of the entire system. Constructive transparency. When data are precise, presented in a non-judgmental way, and considered by peers and used for improvements as well as for external accountability, they serve to balance pressure and support. Sometimes leaders lean on one or the other, right? Pressure or support. We kind of need both. Again, those dichotomies that he's constantly bringing up. All right, secret 6, systems learn. I've kind of touched on this a bit throughout the book because he's really focusing on system learning, not just individual dependency, right? So, even in the best systems, continuous learning is not guaranteed. In a study of long living business, I guess, I don't know how to say that, found that most companies failed to reach their 40th birthday. A key reason why organizations do not sustain learning is that they focus on individual leaders. As individual leaders come and go, the company engages in episodic ups and downs. Skipping down, when a company performs badly, institutional investors are likely to demand that the CEO resign and be replaced by someone who is from outside the firm. The external CEO search process that ensues is characterized by unusual secrecy, anxious attention to the expectations of outsiders, a focus on an extremely small number of candidates, people who are already high profile leaders, and an emphasis on the elusive, culturally biased qualities of leadership and charisma at the expense of concrete knowledge of a firm and its problems. This one cracked me up. I've seen this over and over and over, and I think it's because a large number of companies fail to focus on positive culture, systemized learning, like all these balanced things that he's talking about in this book. And then in the end, they need to blow it up and bring someone else in. And so then they bring someone out from the outside who doesn't have market knowledge, doesn't have the system knowledge, and but they've succeeded in some other place. And that person comes in and implements strange things that are not helpful, more burden on the employees. Then you get this mass exodus of employees. And now you're literally building the business over again. And it's a horrible way to destroy people's careers and an entire business. Whereas in the book Good to Great, they talk about how a lot of the great companies actually had leaders from within who moved up the ranks, were very humble, were kind of low key, built for the system so that the company could go on without them, and they gave credit to the people around them, right? So don't make this mistake. Another section in this is called Focus on Many Leaders. So Toyota's performance shows no leadership effects. This is what I talked about earlier, where that when a leader leaves, they don't even notice it because everyone has been taught to be a leader and to step into one another's roles. The system is built in place, not the people. Navigating complex terrain. He says the second half of Secret 6 is humility because the world is uncertain and no matter what you do, you cannot guarantee a successful future. He says challenge the environment 70%, adapt to the environment 30%. So you really got to be humble about what you're doing, right? Hopefully your knowledge, expertise, and experience can cut down the risk and improve the reward for whatever you're doing, driving towards. But you need to also understand there's thousands and even billions of factors out there that could change the track you're in, right? Whether it's a natural thing, a new competitor, or a new technology, whatever. There's an accident. Like so many things could change the path you're on. So there's no guaranteed success. So be humble about it. In his book, In an Uncertain World, Robert Rubin, who was President Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury from 1995 to 99, captures elements of Secret 6. Some people I've encountered in various phases of my career seem more certain about everything than I am about anything. That kind of certainty represents an attitude that seems to misunderstand the very nature of reality, its complexity and ambiguity, and thereby to provide a rather poor basis for working through decisions in a way that is likely to lead to better results. I thought that made me giggle. I kind of feel the same way. Like, I don't feel that certain about anything. And then I come across these people who are just absolutely sure of so much politically. And it's like the right has it all correct and the left is the devil. And then you run into someone else that thinks the exact same thing about the left being right and the right is completely corrupt. It's like, have you looked at history at all? Like, both parties have horrible things on their resume and a few wins, and then it's just such a dirty game. It's like, how can you be so on one side of this political spectrum when it's such a cesspool? Like, I don't know, but even in saying that it's a cesspool, like, I've come across really kind, generous, caring, productive politicians as well. So it's like you've got all kinds of stuff in there. You can't be that certain. And then you're talking about problems, systems, and data that are so massive. That's like, how, how could you as an individual even know? Like, how could you know? I mean, let's talk about the election, right? Certain people think that Trump won, but it was a cheat and he didn't receive it. My question is, how do you actually know anything about the reality? Like, just because someone reported fraudulent votes or counts or whatever, how do you know that they're actually right and telling the truth? You can't, you don't. So you just kind of have to go, well, this is what I think, but I'm not really sure, right? It's funny. I come across that all the time. People that are so certain. All right, 4 paradoxes. So Pfeffer and Sutton, as they take us through the minefields of hard facts, dangerous half truths, and the total nonsense, end up with the most cogent advice. There are 4 paradoxes and the corresponding guidelines. So here's those 4 paradoxes. Number 1, everyone expects leaders to matter a lot. Number 2, and I'm paraphrasing these, because leaders succumb to the same self-enhancements as everyone else, magnified by the adulation they receive, they have a tendency to lose their behavioral inhibitions and behave in destructive ways. Number 3, because the desirability of exercising total control is itself a half-truth, effective leaders must learn when and how to get out of the way. Number 4, leaders often have the most positive impact when they help build systems where a few powerful and magnificently skilled people matter the least. So, out of these 4 paradoxes come 4 guidelines for the action. Number 1, act and talk as if you were in control and project confidence. 2, take credit and some blame. 3, talk about the future. 4, be specific about the few things that matter and keep repeating them. Don't keep chasing a new thing, new thing all the time. Figure out what actually matters and just work on that. So I'm just going to end with this. This is actually into the conclusion now. He says, Morrill and Caparel list a few of Shackleton's leadership traits. So here's a list of traits. Cultivate a sense of compassion and responsibility for others. Once you commit, stick through the tough learning period. Do your part to create an upbeat environment at work, important for productivity. Broaden your cultural and social horizons, learning to see things from different perspectives. In a rapidly changing world, be willing to venture in new directions to seize new opportunities and learn new skills. Find a way to turn setbacks and failures to your own advantage. Be bold in vision and careful in planning. Learn from past mistakes. Lastly, never insist on reaching a goal at any cost. It must be achieved without undue hardship for your staff. And he actually has an example about that of 2 different crews that were trying to cross an ocean and get to a certain place, and it was like in the Arctic Ocean, and so it was cold. Anyway, the one that was hell bent, harsh, driven, his goal was to win. Crew members died. They had all kinds of problems, and the other crew, the leader was much more a collective. He was focused on his people. His goal was to make sure they made it, and they had a very successful journey. And so, cultivate those leadership skills. I thought this book did a very good job of sort of highlighting the dichotomies of leadership, where it's not about being super assertive all the time. It's about having some assertiveness and some like self-deprecation or lack of confidence in like everything but confidence in your team, right? And so it's like you could kind of balance these different things, like use the data but not all the data, focus on one thing or a few things and then repeat those over and over, rely on the skills of your teams to do it, create systems that are not dependent on individuals, but that when individuals step into your system they become a leader, right? Like so many different things that you hear leaders talk about, like this is the thing, but it's actually a balance of multiple things that makes a good leader. So the six secrets of change, what the best leaders do to help their organizations survive and thrive, by Michael Fullan. I will put a link in the notes so that you can purchase this from Amazon. And I appreciate you guys tuning in to this one. And we'll catch you on the next one. Adios.